Anger, wrath, fury. There are a lot of words for the most volatile of emotions, and it has been one of the most powerful motivators through both history and fiction. Anger can be used to push through insurmountable pain, ignoring all else save for the burning feeling that keeps you going. The Vikings understood this well, so much so that it is from them that we eventually coined the term berserker, which has largely come to be synonymous with another term, barbarians. Although the initial term of barbarians doesn't actually mean anything about roving hordes of marauders. Instead, it originated from Greece to refer to any foreigners, since to the Greeks any language they spoke just sounded like bar, meaning that technically everyone today who doesn't speak ancient Greek is also a barbarian. There's a joke about Greek majors in there somewhere, but I'm not going to be the one who makes it. Nowadays, you could say barbarian and people would get a pretty clear image in their head that would either come from the Vikings or the Mongols. The Mongols were actually rather sophisticated, but the Vikings? Oh yeah, they were the quintessential barbarians. I can say that since my ancestry goes back to Normandy, and by extension, the Vikings. Fun fact, the Normans that Normandy is named for was a colloquial translation that meant Northmen, or Norsemen, aka the Norse, aka Vikings. Hello everyone, I am the Hearth Guy, and we're back on this campaign through the D&D inspired countdowns. If you haven't already, the Green Scorpion, one of the guys who inspired me to start this YouTube thing, as well as this series of videos period, did a video on top 10 berserkers a few years back. Go and watch that right now because it is an excellent video and he deserves the views. Also, it might be better than mine, but that's just the imposter syndrome talking. Something that's probably well known by now is that the original berserkers were Vikings who, through training and probably the usage of shrooms or some other kind of drug, could fly into bloodthirsty rages that would strike fear into the hearts of their enemies and friends alike. In D&D, the barbarian class takes heavy inspiration from this, although with less shrooms. Sometimes. The barbarian class in D&D, and in the many properties that copy D&D's homework, depict barbarians as a high-damage, low-defense style class that instead has large HP to counterbalance their tendency to be in the middle of enemy lines without any heavy armor. Their rage mechanic is also central, letting them momentarily enter into the same kind of fervor that the ancient berserkers could, although in a more streamlined and controllable fashion. Berserkers are actually a subclass of barbarian, but I'll be using the term intermittently with barbarian since the berserker subclass is really just the barbarian class times 2. Every D&D class has something like that. A subclass that's just more of what it already does. Fighters have champions, rogues have thieves, and the barbarians have berserkers. And just like the Artificer video, function and form matters. If a character acts more like a barbarian but another character looks more like a barbarian, the one that acts like it will usually go higher. Bonus points if they can do both, and even more if they mechanically function like a true berserker in their gameplay. So let's continue our D&D inspired perusal through video games and story tropes as we count down the top 10 barbarians in video games. Due to the prevalence of D&D in popular media, especially in Japan where you can find traces of it in tons of their fantasy stories, it's expected to see the traditional class roles be represented even in classic Nintendo or Square Enix products. Now, my experience with Final Fantasy may be limited to one game, but even I know the stranglehold that series has over pop culture. And from that one game, I have chosen a basic but important representative of the barbarian. See, one version of the barbarian archetype is seen with the dark forms, when a character assumes a traditionally evil or sinister form that increases their power, but more often than not also decreases their self-control. And a classic example of that is found in Final Fantasy VII with Vincent Valentine. So Vincent is a peculiar character in Final Fantasy VII. For starters, he's an optional character that you can easily miss out on. A former Shinra soldier that worked directly under Professor Hojo of all people, and one Lucretia. Vincent quickly fell in love with Lucretia, however, Lucretia was in a relationship with Hojo, which probably should have given Vincent some red flags as to her decision-making skills. That said, Hojo was a douche canoe and intended to experiment on the unborn child he was having with Lucretia. Jeez. Lucretia, in the name of science, went along with the She went along with it. Vincent, being the only sane person in the room, objected to it, which made Hojo shoot him and nearly kill him. Deciding it'd be a shame to waste a fresh body, Hojo experimented on Vincent too, and made his body tougher than your average human. But since he was almost dead anyway, Hojo just sort of left him there. Though unexplained in the original game, in the spin-off, Dirge of Cerberus, we get an explanation for how Vincent survived this. In an effort to save his life, Lucretia implanted two things into Vincent. First was Mako energy infused with chaos, a powerful and unpredictable entity that, like many summons from 7, has a long history in Final Fantasy. The second was something called the Proto-Materia, which subdued chaos and allowed Vincent to control it. Vincent would awaken afterwards with little knowledge of what happened, and only know that he now possessed incredible powers and crippling depression about Lucretia. See, soon after, Lucretia would get sick and die upon giving birth to her son, the very same one Hojo experimented on. That son's name was Sephiroth. Vincent would lock himself beneath the Shinra Manor in Nibelheim for 20 years, until Cloud and his company show up and open his coffin. Initially uninterested and a bit gloomy, Vincent gives them the cold shoulder, but later decides to follow along when he realizes they'll lead him to Hojo for some much-needed vengeance. There's a lot more to get into, but as the remakes aren't done and I don't believe he'll be a playable character in them anyway, I'm going to focus on him in the original. In combat, Vincent uses guns that are honestly pretty mid. They do decent enough damage, but he's far from a heavy hitter like Cloud and Tifa, although he makes up for it with some better accuracy. Vincent's real niche is his limit breaks, where he unleashes the power of chaos within to transform into various monstrous shapes. You lose control of him as a party member, but he gains remarkable resistances and abilities that lets him easily outclass most other party members in damage dealing, and even tanking in some respects. It's honestly more optimal to let Vincent go feral as soon as possible, because once he's on a roll, he does not stop. Pair him up with some party members sporting support materia, as well as some buffing materia of his own, and Vincent can become a battering ram to most enemies. On the other hand, the inability to control him, while very pertinent for this list, can be seen as a downside if he's not doing exactly what you'd prefer him to be doing. Outside of that, when not thrashing around as a demon or whatever, Vincent is cool and restrained, with only hints of some simmering anger appearing when facing down Hojo at long last near the end of the game. With that much needed catharsis out of the way, Vincent can also wind up, somehow facing the ghost of Lucretia. What is this? Spooky ghost cave aside, Vincent is able to get some closure as he lets Lucretia's soul rest, steeling himself to put her wayward son to rest as well. He's not a complicated character, despite what the emo energy may suggest, and his optional nature means he gets fewer parts in the story. This hinders his chances for characterization and limits his place on this list, along with a lack of emphasis on rage at all in his transformation. There are analogs between his limit breaks and the Path of a Beast, or even the Path of Wild Magic subclasses, but even that's a bit of a reach. But there are worse places to be than number 10. And trust me, Vincent knows that well. Mass Effect doesn't always fit the conventional RPG mold, at least mechanically speaking. But remarkably, it gave me not one, not two, but 3 characters that I could consider for this list. Grunt the Perfect Krogan, Jack the Psychotic Biotic, and Zaid Collateral Damage Masani. Things went back and forth in my mind a lot between these 3 options. Krogans like Grunt canonically experienced something called the Blood Rage, Jack tore apart a space station in her first appearance, and Zaid is Zaid. Whereas throughout the 2 games all 3 appear in, Jack and Zaid can mellow out a bit through your interactions with them. Grunt only gets more and more unhinged. In Mass Effect, there are the Krogan, a race of hyper-aggressive lizard people that once upon a time were uplifted by the Galactic Council to defeat the encroaching alien race called the Rachni. Afterwards, the Krogan began to expand rapidly, and when the Council tried to stop them, the Krogan rebelled. Years and years of war later, the Council invite another race, the Turians, to beat back the Krogan, and with the aid of the scientists of the Solarians, they developed a surefire way to cripple the naturally strong and quickly reproducing Krogan, the genophage, a fertility plague that drastically decreases the total number of viable pregnancies among the Krogan people. With this one action, the Krogan were shattered into dozens of petty, squabbling tribes back on their homeworld of Tuchanka, as their people, planet, and culture slowly died. Pretty bleak, huh? Well, one guy eventually came up with something of an answer. Okeer was a despised warlord and scientist of the Krogan who, in exile, was tracked down by Shepard during the events of Mass Effect 2, in hopes of recruiting him for the dangerous fight against the mass kidnapping collectors. And what do we do but find Okeer in the middle of a giant junkyard swarming with mercenaries trying to kill you, and a bunch of Krogan who each were grown in a test tube. Past all that, Shepard and crew find Okeer working on his magnum opus, a genetically perfect Krogan, unsullied and immune to the ravages of the genophage. Okeer's final insult to the plague on his people, the insult of being ignored. And I do mean final, as while Okeer is finishing his work, the mercenaries' leader, who Okeer previously promised an army of Krogan to, starts gassing the room as revenge for Okeer double-crossing her. We defeat the mercenary, but not before Okeer dies from exposure and leaves us his final gift. Grunt. Grunt's class/passive ability is Krogan Berserker, which for starters, boosts his health, damage, and regeneration as well as, well, look at the name. Grunt is a hardline fighter who comes equipped with concussive shot to stun enemies and break armor, and the incendiary ammo to add fire damage to his every attack. As soon as we take Grunt home and wake him up, it's very apparent that he's not like most Krogan. His speech is even, he is contemplative, and most importantly, he feels absolutely nothing for the plight of his people. In fact, his apathy is a cause for concern from Grunt, who's been designed with millennia of Krogan history in his brain but feels no connection to it. That is, until the midpoint of the game where Grunt starts getting rather agitated. Heading to Tuchanka to find out what's wrong, we learn that Grunt is, going through puberty. Okay, it's not exactly the same, but we do learn that there's one surefire way to fix it. Dropping Grunt and friends in the middle of nowhere to fight increasing waves of animals trying to eat him. You even get to fight a thresher maw, which is basically like if a planet could get tapeworms. This isn't just blind killing, though. For the Krogan, it serves as a test to see not only if one of their own is strong enough to live on their scrap heap of a planet, but it's also a test of the Krogan themselves. Any Krogan is allowed to bring a Krant, a group of allies that deem them worth fighting for. Guess who Grunt's Krant is? At first, Grunt treats it like an obligation so he can get back to normal. But as it goes on, and as his blood gets pumping, Grunt finally understands what it means to be Krogan. So much so that when a Krogan chief who had previously tried to bar Grunt from being allowed to do the final test attempts to get Grunt to join his clan for clout, Grunt feels actual indignation at the dishonorable suggestion. After killing said chief because Grunt was angry, Grunt comes to terms with his Krogan nature, and becomes the most unhinged version of himself. Describing in detail how to kill a Turian, running headfirst into frequent peril, and reading Ernest Hemingway. What? Grunt chooses you as his battle master, the one he deems worthy of fighting for, and will risk his hide for you through thick and thin. And this loyalty awards him the fortification ability, which generates an extra barrier around his body to make him even harder to kill. He goes further with his loyalty in Mass Effect 3, where though he's not a squad mate, he remains loyal. Loyal enough to sacrifice himself to give you time to escape from an encroaching swarm of twisted and mutated Rachni controlled by the Reapers. Just like a real Krogan. Just kidding. You think that'll keep Grunt down? Nothing can keep Grunt down.
So, how were those noodles?
A little spicy.
I love you, Grunt.
I had an inordinately hard time pinning down a barbarian from the Fire Emblem franchise. Despite traditionally having the barbarian or berserker class, the options for this list were rather skin deep. Most never went beyond just having a big axe and high HP. That said, although none really fit the mold mechanically, there was one that, character-wise, certainly fit the bill. And in hindsight, he was kind of the obvious choice. Why? Well...
Kill every last one of them!
Yeah. That. Dmitry Alexander Blazed is a character who likely needs no introduction, but to keep with the format of this list, I'm going to anyway. The Crown Prince of the Northern Kingdom of Fargus, Dimitri is a studious and mild-mannered young man with deep senses of honor and chivalry. Many of these traits are a result of the influence of Rodrigue, his father's old friend, who is perhaps the one stable influence left in his life. He serves as the balance to many of the more volatile personalities in the Blue Lion's house that he leads while attending the Officer Academy. If you choose to join his house, either in Three Hopes or Houses, and based off how thirsty people are for him, I know plenty of you did, you get the chance to know him better, as well as see how he relates to his fellow students. However, it's during this time with him that you will realize some darker tendencies of his. See, when Dimitri was a young boy, his father took him on a diplomatic trip to the neighboring land of Dusker, during which the king hoped to secure peace between his land and theirs. Things did not go as planned. Instead, an ambush was sprung on the king's group, and Dimitri was forced to witness every single night, including his friend and Roderick's son Glenn, his father, and presumably his stepmother, all be murdered and burned alive, leaving some deep emotional scarring, especially after the ensuing massacre of the largely innocent people of Dusker. Dimitri developed two unhealthy coping mechanisms. First, he began to hallucinate the image of his dead loved ones calling to him from beyond the grave, demanding justice for their deaths. And second, Dimitri formed a very short tolerance for anything he labeled as evil, unjust, or wicked. The mask of kind young man slipping off as soon as anything he deems as unacceptable comes into view, becoming a violent, near-psychotic animal with superhuman strength. In Three Hopes, the boar is largely left simmering beneath the surface, but in Houses, the beast becomes the center of Dimitri's personality, after the reveal of Edelgard as the Flame Emperor, who, due to a few miscommunications and false assumptions, Dimitri believes is responsible for almost every bad thing that has happened in his life. A betrayal that stings more due to the fact that the two of them were childhood friends and even step-siblings. Spiraling from there and left alone for 5 years, Dimitri returns after the time skip a shadow of himself that brutalizes every Imperial soldier he comes across. It is only through the intervention of Byleth and the death of Rodrigue that Dimitri is snapped back to his senses. Once he's back on the right track, he begins the process of reclaiming his lost homeland. Dimitri's homeland is deeply reliant on crests, magical hereditary traits that both grant innate abilities to some and allow the use of heroes' relics, weapons of mass destruction that are found in the highest number in Fargus. Dimitri himself was born with the crest of Blathed, which granted him super strength and the ability to wield Aridfar, the most busted lance in the game. Combined with incredible strength and the signature move lovingly named Atrocity, Aridfar and Dimitri go together like JRPGs and morally questionable religious organizations. In battle, Dimitri outperforms pretty much every other physical attacker, with some exceptions perhaps being the other lords. In regards to critical hits though, Dimitri has them both beat. I even dare say that it's more impressive to somehow not get him to perform a crit at least once in every battle that he's a part of. I know I haven't been talking much about his Hopes performance, since that has far less connection to his more barbarian-like attributes, but it does apply to how he performs in combat. At least for me, he's the most enjoyable of the lords to play around, and only Shez is more satisfying. With that in mind, like I mentioned at the start, it's his character alone that I use to classify as a barbarian. Some of that still remains even after his turnaround, and it never really leaves at Three Hopes, but in both cases it becomes far weaker. And of course, as I said before, Fire Emblem doesn't really have great examples of barbarians or berserkers, and while you have a lot of flexibility with how you choose to build Dimitri, no matter what, he won't wind up resembling a proper barbarian. In something of a cruel irony, it's by becoming a better person that he becomes less like a barbarian, and therefore sheds the very traits that got him to be considered for this list. Shedding those traits results in him falling to number 8, but I don't think he'd mind the trade-off.
I should have known that one day you would be haunting me as well.
We've been starving for some classic barbarians on this list, so I think it's time we change that. The OG barbarians were the Viking berserkers, as stated before, so surely there's some folks who take that and really run with it. Oh, buddy, there sure are. But of the ones to pick, I decided to choose someone who is something of a culmination, a reference upon a reference, from a game that loves referencing the one thing everyone loves referencing, Berserk. No, it's not Dark Souls. No, this comes from the indie game Fear and Hunger, and its Outlander from the north, Ragnvaldr. In the far north, the kingdom of Oldegard exists, home to a people that find themselves naturally in the wilds. The Outlanders of Oldegard were sailors and raiders who used their experience in the wilds to survive in distant lands. In essence, they're Vikings. And like the Vikings, they crossed the great western sea to the dark continent of Vinland. Among these travelers was Ragnvaldr, a man born with the soul of the tormented, which bound him to a life of struggle. They fought vicious locals and plundered their temples, where they found something dark. A cube with a connection to the old god of the depths. With their plunder, they returned across the sea, a perilous voyage that drained their food supply, making some resort to cannibalism. But Ragnvaldr survived. He arose from the suffering and found his way home. There, he and his clansmen were celebrated, and Ragnvaldr could return to his family. But no sooner had he returned than the mercenary company of the Midnight Sun fell upon Oldegard. They slaughtered his village, pillaged their treasures, and took the Cube of the Depths for the ambitions of their leader, Lagard. Like the Oldegard fairy tale of the Skin Granny, who would steal and skin families as the men were away, Ragnvaldr returned to his home to find his wife and child dead. From that day, he swore vengeance on Lagard and took his bow as he chased Lagard to the dungeons of fear and hunger. As one of the 4 playable classes, Ragnvaldr has low armor but high attack, like a proper barbarian. The list of skills he has natural access to as a tormented soul also lends to this. Devour gives him utility, as it lets him eat the flesh of fallen foes to circumvent the hunger part of fear and hunger. He has a classic barbarian rage skill called Bloodlust, which boosts his attacks, but makes you, the player, lose control over him for the duration, which is actually one of his less useful skills, as being precise about where you attack is the cornerstone to Fear and Hunger's combat. It's more manageable if there are other party members, but good luck making it work on a solo run, or if you're going for one of those S-rank endings. He can also learn the skill Warcry, which again is more useful in a party of multiple characters, since it attracts attention to him. But his marksmanship skill provides an interesting utility in its own right, since he can pull out his bow and potentially kill an enemy without needing to enter combat, which is always risky in the dungeon. Whether you play as Ragnvaldr or find him later as a companion, he's here to hunt Lagard. And as a player character, he is the only one with the power to murder the would-be Griffith when you find him. And if you keep Lagard around as a companion, then as a companion, Ragnvaldr will pick a fight with him, and you'll have to kill one or the other. Frankly, unless you're going for a specific ending, Ragnvaldr is the superior choice almost all the time. Characters are sometimes limited by Fear and Hunger's very nature, but in their simplicity, there's chance for easy connection. Ragnvaldr just wants his family and his people avenged. As time goes on, he wants answers to why Lagard wanted the cube. Inevitably, this will lead him down darker and darker caverns, but Ragnvaldr would ultimately find his own way. Canon ending for Ragnvaldr is his S-rank ending, in which he tames the monster hound Moonless and becomes the fabled god of ultra-violence. Not a true god, but a mythical dark hero who would go on to slaughter the monsters of the world, clearing out the horrors to make way for humanity. I jumbled about a bit as to whether to count Ragnvaldr as either a ranger or a barbarian, but I ultimately focused on his character-based traits in combination to his initial inheritable skills, which all point towards a more barbarian style save for his marksmanship, and maybe Devour, but that could just go either way. Honestly, it was a close decision, and I may be regretting it whenever the ranger video comes around, but I've made my choice, and it's here he falls. Welcome to the Barbarian Club, Ragnvaldr. You fit right in. There's a certain line you have to walk when it comes to different depictions of rage and madness. Anger is one thing, but to be a barbarian is to let that rage be all-consuming or weaponized in some facet. In real life, these are a genuine problem that someone might struggle with. Not to the same degree in most cases, obviously, but they still bear mentioning. I preface this as such so I can say that Lily from Fallout New Vegas is both one of the most wholesome and oddly depressing portrayals of how a barbarian would really work. Found in the super mutant town of Jacobstown, Lily finds refuge here after the events of the very first Fallout game. During that time, she was an 80-something-year-old grandma who was living in an underground vault, when one day the forces of the Master, the warped creator of the Western super mutants, broke in and kidnapped or killed everyone inside. Lily was one of those kidnapped, and she would be subjected to the FEV, or the Forced Evolutionary Virus. Lily was subsequently transformed into a Nightkin, a subset of mutant which the Master used as stealth troops. However, they relied on the use of stealth boys, which had an adverse effect on their biology, resulting in schizophrenic and psychotic tendencies, which became a big problem once the Master was defeated and the mutants were scattered. Like her other Nightkin brethren, Lily suffers from similar mental scars and traumas. She does have medication offered by the former Enclave scientist working with the Jacobstown mutants to cure their schizophrenia, as well as their addiction to stealth boys. Now when it comes to Lily, those stealth boys have been rather helpful, as shown in her Stealth Girl perk, which makes stealth boys last twice as long and sneak attacks do an additional 10% damage. Compared to other barbarians on this list, it makes her rather stealth-focused, but I suppose hiding a freight train until it's right on top of your opponent is more effective than just aiming it at them. It's not just her special perk, as her agility is maxed out at 10 for even better stealth, and she has 100 points in that skill. Her other boosted skills are heavily combat-oriented, with 9 in strength and up to 100 in melee, which makes sense since she's running around with a former vertibird blade as a weapon. Like many of her fellow Nightkin, Lily's delusions are harsh, in part due to her only taking half doses of her medications. See, Lily still has memories of her time before becoming a super mutant, and even a recording of her grandchildren's voices, but when she takes her medicine at full dose it causes memory loss, even if it calms her worst symptoms. Lily doesn't want to forget, but she also doesn't want to hurt anyone, so she takes half doses and does her best to live out her life. Which is a problem when the primary voice of her hallucinations is a figure called Leo, which embodies those dark impulses. He tells her to give in, to become crazed and tear into everything in front of her, and if she gets hurt enough, then she will, breaking loose out of your control and unable to interact with her until her frenzy dies down, repeating a mantra of counting from 1 to 10 in order to calm herself. She's a living wrecking ball when she's like this, but she's also, not to be too mean to her, a very effective living shield. As even in her code, she tends to step between the player and danger, seeing the courier more often than not as one of her own grandchildren. And she steps up very quick too. As a super mutant, her run cycle is just naturally faster than the player's, so she can bolt ahead in a heartbeat before you even know what's happening. Still, it's not hard to feel bad for Lily. Later on, when she tells you about her medicine, you get the choice to encourage her to take it, discard it altogether, or trust her to keep half dosing. I usually can't help but let her do what she's been doing. She's been around for over 200 years, so those memories of her family are her last lifeline to the normal life she once had. Who am I to tell her to abandon that? Beyond that, Lily never becomes a pivotal character in any major faction quest, nor does she involve herself against any particular side in New Vegas. But as long as she's protecting her family, or those she believes are her family, Lily is a-okay.
That's sweet of you, dearie. I'll try to be better about controlling myself if I see you try to sneak away.
You know, I never intend to reuse franchises like with Mass Effect and Fire Emblem, but sometimes it's a natural result of the kinds of stories or games they are. Of course you can find parallels to D&D classes in a fantasy-based game like Fire Emblem, or in RPGs like Mass Effect, even if it's to a different degree. And as a result, I will wind up reusing franchises on these countdowns, even if I really try to branch out. Is this coping because I feel unoriginal for reusing Darkest Dungeon 2? Maybe. With some seriousness, the Hellion is a very solid example of a barbarian, not just because of her rage mechanic, Adrenaline Rush, that boosts damage and accuracy along with curing the bleed and blight effect. Her stats are also set with high HP and little to no defensive stats built in. Her specialty, alongside buffing herself with that Adrenaline Rush, is her heavy frontal attacks, which aim to inflict as much damage as possible to as many enemies as possible. The Breakthrough skill can push her forward in the party positions and do damage to almost every enemy row, and for that last back one which is safe, she can break out Iron Swan. For frontal crowd control, she has Barbaric Yawp, a shout which can stun the front 2 rows, with the side effect of lowering her own attack and speed for the next 3 rounds. Her strongest move, though, is Bleed Out, which inflicts heavy bleed damage, as well as inflicting the same debuff that Barbaric Yop does. Overuse of these skills in prolonged combat is a recipe for getting your Hellion killed, however. As a sort of pre-prepared version of Adrenaline Rush, she possesses the Battle Trance camping skill to prep herself with a 25 increase to damage for the following 4 battles. The word Hellion just means someone who causes trouble and makes a ruckus, but Darkest Dungeon's Hellion's preset true name is Boudica, the legendary Celtic queen who rebelled against Roman rule. Her rebellion ultimately failed, but she was remembered as a hero by the Celtic people, and as a barbarous warrior by the Romans. The Hellion is just so a potentially Pyrrhic leader in battle, as she is meant to thrive at the front, but a few good hits can wind up with her dead if you don't make contingencies to cover up for those weaknesses. Strong armor or a man-at-arms to take the hits, any way to make even one attack hit less than it would normally is essential. Keep all that in mind, and your own Barbarous Queen could be cutting a bloody swath out of the dungeons for you.
Eradicated.
Rage can be a very relatable emotion. Especially in this day and age, it seems people get angry over pretty much everything. Usually it's over politics or some kind of scandal or other things that tend to have real-world consequences upon a person or a group of people. So there can be a great catharsis for seeing a character in fiction get mad and act on the anger in some kind of way we might want to feel vindication via the actions of a likable or relatable character who unleashes their anger to fight against some kind of injustice. That's not the kind of character we're talking about for number 4. This character is petty, and more than a little stupid. He embodies all the negative traits of letting your anger rule you. It can make you great strides as a warrior, but put those impulses first and you can lose your title, your respect, and even your whole family. Turning you into a disgruntled man-child that gets drunker than an entire port full of sailors, even though he's never seen an ocean in his life. Man, Oghren is such a mess. Okay, I swear that not every one of these lists are going to have Mass Effect and Dragon Age characters on them, but come on. Oghren is quintessentially a barbarian. The order of warriors he trained with practice hitting their new recruits in the cojones to trigger their first rage and teach them how to channel it. And for some time that worked out for him. He and several warriors of his house rose to prominence due to a number of victories in battle and in the Provings, the gladiatorial honor fights in dwarf society. His acts got him a lot of female attention, including those from a merchant woman named Felsi, but he was set up with a smith woman named Branka by his house. Still, Branka and Oghren got along well for the first year of their marriage, until Branka went and created a smokeless coal rising to the ranks of a paragon, making her the equivalent of an avatar of virtue and considered a living ancestor, which the dwarves revered and worshipped. But the strain of this sudden change took its toll. Branka's frequent absence left Oghren alone and resentful, turning to alcohol to soothe him. This would grow worse by Branka's own growing disdain for Oghren and her eventual affair with Oghren's cousin, Hespeth, which was known to pretty much everyone except Oghren. Branka's disdain would rub off on the rest of her house, and Oghren would effectively be shunned by what was once his own family, pushing him further into the bottom of the keg. Eventually, Branka took her whole house, excluding the objecting Oghren, into the massive underground network of dwarven roads called the Deep Roads, in search of the Anvil of the Void, which held the secret to creating golems, and art long lost to the dwarves. Abandoned twice over and with no word from his house for years, Oghren became a local laughingstock, and he tried to find some modicum of peace in having his own affair with Felsi. Unfortunately, she had standards, and after Oghren caused a scene at her father's funeral, she left him and the underground for the surface. His situation deteriorated further and further when he slaughtered a noble's youngest son in a drunken duel for daring to suggest Branka and his house were all dead. As a result, he had his house name stripped and his weapons confiscated, being disbarred from ever possessing a weapon in the city. From that day after, Oghren became something of a nuisance to anyone who would listen to him, as he tried to convince anyone to go looking for Branka and his house. That's the state we find him in Dragon Age Origins, and it's in that state that we can moderately help him. We can track down Branka for him, though she's gone totally off the rails and had all her house members killed or worse in search for the Anvil. And even if you decide to side with her and let her have the anvil, she abandons Oghren yet again. I mean, considering you learn that the anvil creates golems by trapping souls in suits of metal and stone and depriving them of free will, at this point I'd say killing her is no great loss. So whether she's alive or dead, Oghren's on your side now, and comes with you to fight the Darkspawn and save the world. And in practice, he's not too bad at it. His default Berserker class grants him passive buffs to health and strength, which pairs well with the two-handed skills he already has unlocked upon recruiting him. The prime focus of the subclass is, of course, the Berserk skill, that increases his damage but induces a penalty to his stamina regeneration. Higher ranks grant him resilience and constraint, which buff his health regeneration and limits the debuff on his stamina regen respectively. As for his ultimate skill from the Berserker class, he gets Final Blow, which channels all his remaining stamina into a singular attack that does equivalent damage based off how much stamina he has remaining. Berserker as a specialization is a blunt instrument, much like Oghren, and he's frequently weak to magical attacks and effects, though as a dwarf he has some natural resistance, but more often than not it's not enough to counterbalance the weaknesses. Pairing him with any other warrior subclass can really cover any of his faults in combat. The Templar class can cover up his magical weaknesses, Reaver can efficiently make his low defense into a weapon, and Champion can just give him better defense so he's a living wall and a wrecking ball. For all his character flaws, with some attention, he can become the furry, spiteful ball of rage you need to rip and shred into enemies, and can even become your most loyal, if not your most sober, friend. Especially if you help him rekindle that old flame with Felsi, which becomes a downright bonfire after the Darkspawn are dealt with. He marries and has a kid, getting a respected position in the army. But to be Oghren is to screw things up. Oghren got to drinking again, and the life of a family man was not his forte. His hands were only ever taught to break things, and after dropping his newborn son twice, he came to the conclusion he wasn't fit to be a husband or a father, and left without a word to join the Grey Wardens. Now, again, you can encourage Oghren to do right by Felsi at least a bit, but he's a Grey Warden now, and you can't just undo that. But you can get him to take an involved role in his son's life. Once again, Oghren seeks you as his moral compass, which is honestly necessary at this point because this man both can't swim and yet still finds himself drunker than any sailor could ever hope to be.
It's got its sallow, clammy hands all over my doodads, touching my junk. No one touches Oghren's junk and lives!
The Companions, Skyrim. A bit of a mix between barbarians and rangers, but with their leaders being werewolves, I think they deserve a mention at least. Goro Akechi, Persona 5, was at number 10 originally, but some reshuffling led to him falling to the honorable mentions. Stay crazy, Pancake Boy. In war, there are few noble tactics and few noble causes. More often than not, war is fought for power alone, and we all just have to decide which is more deserving of that power. Those caught in between must then suffer the price for such a thing. But victims don't tend to forget or forgive, and within them can burn violence sharper than any blade, more brutal than any bullet. A rage and frenzy that seeks to rip and shred through everything in sight, like a hungering blade. And in that place, to carry the burden of violence so others don't have to, can be found Jack the Ripper, better known as Raiden. Raiden's past is a long and complicated one that I don't fully understand personally. I'll get around to the other Metal Gear games eventually. But the man who'd become Raiden was born in Liberia during the First Civil War, raised by the man who killed his parents as a child soldier. Raiden grew to be very effective at his job, and earned the title Jack the Ripper. After the Civil War, he was brought back to America and kept on fighting for the Patriots, a secret paramilitary organization that wanted to perpetuate war across the world to feed the military-industrial complex. Because clearly this is a fictional story and in no way indicative of real life. He eventually joined up with everyone's favorite Smash Bros. Character, Solid Snake, and helped put down the Patriots. But from what I can tell, he was a secondary character in Snake's story, for the most part anyway. Or perhaps you'd call him a protege. But for the purposes of this list, we're looking at his own story, his own game, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Years after defeating the Patriots and now viewing himself as something of a modern samurai, fighting for the sake of justice and peace, Raiden's a part of his own private security company now. But everything changes when a Brazilian with an LED sword attacks. Jetstream Sam and the Desperado company he's attached to kill Raiden's client, cut off his arm, which is actually something that happens a lot for him apparently, and lead him down a rabbit hole of government conspiracy and terrorism involving the trafficking of organs harvested from children. Because clearly, this is fiction. Through this, Raiden would be forced to confront why he fights. Not just the fighting itself or what he tells himself, but the actual reason of why. Turns out, deep down, Raiden still enjoys it. The thrill of combat. The rush of the kill. Through the first half of the game, Raiden denies any sort of similarity between himself and those he's fighting, trying to completely disconnect from them. But he has to admit the truth eventually. This manifests as his Ripper mode. When he faces against Monsoon, an enemy he can't beat by conventional means, and after Sam has assaulted his ideas of morality only a moment prior, Raiden gives in just enough. He lets the killer out of the box. In Ripper mode, he gets rid of the necessary precision needed for cutting and hacking at weak parts of an enemy, which was used in the first half of the game to concisely cut at weak points. Instead, he's able to just tear apart his enemy without needing for accuracy or care, just raw violence. But while Jack has admitted to this more brutal side of himself, he's still fighting for what he believes to be the right reasons. To stop an oncoming war, to stop the perpetuation of violence, even if he has to paradoxically use violence to achieve it. This brings him against Jetstream Sam, and the true mind behind all of this, Senator Armstrong, who's basically an internet meme celebrity. In Armstrong, Raiden sees parts of his own philosophy, but it's twisted just enough to make him unable to accept it. Both of them see violence as a tool to end violence, but Armstrong waves that brush generally, and will allow many to die for that, while Raiden only focuses on those directly ahead of him, which includes Armstrong. Raiden's journey of rage and his acceptance of it as a tool is a bit more philosophical than most other barbarians, and while he is technically something of a rogue assassin type, he abandons that in revengeance for more upfront combat. Besides, you can't see this guy wielding a sword the size of a bridge and call him a stealth fighter. This guy's just an edgy barbarian at heart, and we love him for it.
Why don't I give you a demonstration? I think it's time for Jack to let her rip.
We've talked a lot about different types of barbarian-styled characters, those that weaponize their anger, those that let their anger control them, and those that are victims to themselves and their anger as just a side effect. But the rage of some are so great that even the mightiest must seek to restrain it in order to serve responsibilities with distinction, holding it in like a boiling cauldron, a rumbling volcano fit to erupt into a wave of carnage as soon as it is free, whenever they are ready to rage. In some ways, my number 2 does not have the means to do this himself. His hunger for combat is simply too great. Instead, he took upon a mighty beast to contain his wrath, to act as a vessel for it. His beast regent. Upon taking that on, he went from a mere warrior to a true lord. In the lore of Elden Ring, Hoarah was a simple warrior that became renowned for his might, so much so that he earned the respect of the Crucible Knights, an order of knights tied to the primordial crucible from which all life was said to have come. But soon enough, Queen Marika ascended as goddess of the Golden Order, and she needed a lord to enforce her order. She chose Hoarah, but his wilder ways was not suited for the regal bearing of a lord. So in accordance with his new queen, he took upon the beast regent Sorosh onto his back to quell his rage, and with this he became Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. Between the giants, the dragons, and the mighty Storm Lord, who he faced and defeated alone, Godfrey was the bulwark of Marika's forces. His influence on the world is felt in all corners. Crucible Knights, who were once opposed to the Erdtree, joined its ranks under him. He fathered the beloved Godwyn the Golden and his line, which include the likes of Godric, and his legend was such that it inspired Radahn, the mightiest of the demigods, to style himself in Godfrey's image. In fact, every Tarnished, the player characters of Elden Ring, trace their lineage back to Godfrey. In his time as Marika's husband, he also fathered the likes of Mohg and Morgott, the Omen twins. But for Omens to be born to the Elden Lord and Queen Marika would be a shameful scandal. so they were sealed underground, perhaps before Godfrey ever had a chance to know his sons. Then, a moment came, it is said, when the last of Godfrey's worthy foes fell and the hue of his eyes dimmed. Thus, with the light of grace lost from him, Godfrey and his Tarnished were banished from the lands between, to fight, struggle, and die outside of grace. Abandoning his title but keeping Sirach on his back, Godfrey became a simple warrior again. Until the Shattering. When Marika shattered the Elden Ring and the demigods made fools of themselves by fighting each other for its scraps, the grace once bereft of the Tarnished was returned, that they might claim the Elden Ring's pieces for themselves and make whole the Golden Order. Naturally, this included Godfrey, who you encounter as the penultimate boss to the game, cradling his dying son Morgott in his arms, who was mortally wounded halfway through the game by you, and only now dies of his wounds. Sirach lets out a roar of anger, but Godfrey himself stays cool. After all, that is Sirach's purpose. As Morgott dies, Godfrey's own grace of gold points at you, the player, just as yours points at him. With both fighting to claim the throne of Elden Lord, it could only end one way. You had to fight an aspect of him earlier in the game, but nothing compares to the real deal. Shaking and cracking the ground with a footstep, or tearing into you with his axe, Godfrey shows why he was the chosen lord of Marika. As the fight goes on, his rage will build, and so will the shockwaves caused by his attacks. But push him even further, and he'll have no choice but to recognize your strength. Sirach recognizes it too, and begins to make himself manifest to defend Godfrey. But he is stopped, as his master knows there's only one right way for this to go. So Godfrey tears Sirach apart and frees both of them from their obligations, as he fights as Horalu once more, his true warrior's self. His rage untethered, he fights like a WWE wrestler jacked up on the equivalent testosterone of the entire planet. Making distance from him is downright impossible, because even when you try to back up, he practically wave dashes back into your personal space. And don't even think about letting him grab you, because he's about to make every wrestler in history look like they came right out of clown college. His AoE ground attacks increase in range and power too, so you paradoxically have to know when to make distance from him, even though as soon as he's done with that attack, he'll be on top of you again. Fitting for a true warrior and barbarian of the Badlands, Horalu is relentless and ruthless, because as the first Elden Lord, he knows fully well that a crown is warranted by strength. And you'll need all you can muster to bring him down. 'Twas nobly fought, Godfrey, but one stands above even you.
Upon my name as Godfrey, the first Elden Lord.
In the end, there was only one who could stand as the pinnacle of wrath, as an instrument of war. All before used rage as a tool, but each one had to learn about accepting their rage and learning to live with it. None truly faced the reality that their rage would eventually have to subside. Even Godfrey and Raiden both came to the conclusion to either bury the rage deep within, or make that rage part of who they are. But one man, through his wrath, was able to put it to an end, all to save his daughter. Frankly, I'd be surprised if anyone these days didn't know about Ashura's Wrath. The game has resurfaced into internet public eye a number of times, but to simplify it, Ashura was once one of the 8 demigod generals who fought against horrific monsters called Goma that threatened all life. But one day, he was betrayed by his kin. His wife was murdered and his daughter, Mithra, stolen. Mithra was taken for her power to enhance and bless others, which his fellow demigods sought to use for their own purposes. Meanwhile, Asura was thrown from orbit and hit the ground so hard he ended up in Naraka, the Buddhist hell. For eons, the now 7 deities established a new order of sacrificing souls to empower themselves through Mithra's suffering, all for the purpose of eventually wiping out the Goma forever. But Asura's rage was not quelled, even as his own memories were forgotten. He rose up from Naraka with his eyes burning white-hot with indignation. In his first fight with one of the 7 deities, Wyzen, the sparks of his past lit back to life within him. He remembered the injustices placed upon his daughter. even as Wizen's power far surpassed what either had in the past. Even as he grew to greater and larger forms, even as Wizen became larger than the planet, and tried to crush Asura with a god-sized poke, Asura's wrath grew to meet it. While crushed underneath Wizen's finger, his memories returned, and the rage of eons erupted like any good father would in the face of his daughter's suffering. Wizen is no match for such a power, instead only proving Asura's own power in his death. Throughout Asura's wrath, a question is posed to Asura that any other character on this list might hesitate at. If the goal of the 7 deities is to kill the Goma, isn't it an acceptable loss for all the human souls they take and how much Mithra suffers? But to Asura, this question is meaningless, because his wrath demands recompense. It is at time all-consuming, and at one point it drives him to madness, requiring his old rival and brother-in-law Yasha to turn his back on the 7 deities to bring Asura back. Which, of course, can only be done by beating it out of him. Still, Asura fights on, his anger never leaving him. Even Asura doesn't know what it will take for that anger to subside, but with it he fights through his old teacher, Yasha, more than once, and the man who seemingly orchestrated it all, Deus, king of the 7 deities. But even when Deus falls and Mithra is freed, he comes face to face with the true mastermind, Chakravartin, who appeared prior as a golden spider, egging Asura on and encouraging his anger. Chakravartin, the true creator of this world, did all that to prime Asura to become a new god, to take Chakravartin's place so that he might ascend to an even higher plane of existence, which Asura does not give a single iota of a crap about. Chakravartin is just another utilitarianist who made his daughter suffer for some ultimate goal, and that is a crime punishable by being button-mashed out of existence. It takes Yasha's sacrifice to give all remaining power of the 7 deities to Asura, but with it and his self-perpetuating fury, he rises to the size of a planet to challenge Chakravartin's attempt to erase the world. And even while the creator's power is enough to warp reality and give himself button prompts, Asura's wrath is his greatest weapon, because it is wrath that does not control him in this moment. He controls it, because it is born from something pure, a desire to save and to protect. Others on this list raged out of spite or because they could not control it, but Asura exceeds them all because he learned what to be angry about. He learned the value anger has when it is righteous. So when he learns that Chakravartin's death would end in his own, Asura does not waver, because this was never about himself. It was about his daughter, and those who made her cry. And once those who made her cry were all gone, only then does his rage subside, and his eyes, blinded by it, are finally clear, and he can rest in peace.
My wrath is finally gone.
Thank you, as always, for watching. If you got this far in the video, consider liking, commenting, or subscribing to always get a notification on when I next post. A shout out to all my patrons, whose dedication soothes my wrath that lets me keep going without headbutting a wall in despair. Consider signing up for my Patreon or as a part of the YouTube membership program in order to gain access to a private Discord server where you can interact directly with me and anyone else who wants to find a little corner of the internet. After this video, as I'm sure some of you may already know, a very large Xenoblade video is set to come out. Look forward to it. I am the Hearth Guy, and I will see you all next time around the hearth.